sign a statement, or I pull your tuition. Tonight. That was my father. Standing in the hospital hallway under fluorescent lights, still in his golf shirt, not a scratch on him, telling me to confess to a hit and run I didn't commit. My brother Colt was 3 rooms down, getting his wrist wrapped. My car, the one I'd spent 2 years saving for working doubles at the hospital, was folded against a concrete pillar in the Riverside Mall parking garage, and I was supposed to be the one who did it. I want to explain how I got to that moment, because it didn't come out of nowhere. You don't end up standing in a hallway being blackmailed by your own parents unless a lot of smaller things happened first. I'm a pediatric nurse, 26 years old, been working at St. Croix, Augustine's for almost 3 years. I share an apartment with a co-worker named Jules about 12 minutes from the hospital, but that Saturday I'd driven back to my parents' house in Delwood for my mom's birthday dinner. My brother was already there when I arrived. I could smell it on him before I even hugged him hello. That stale sweet smell that means he'd been drinking since at least noon. Colt is 23. He's finishing a business degree at Harwick University, where he also plays lacrosse. My parents treat that lacrosse career the way some people treat a religion. Every conversation eventually circles back to it. Every family decision gets filtered through it. There's a framed photo of him mid-shot in the hallway right next to the front door, so it's literally the first thing you see when you walk in. I stopped being surprised by any of it a long time ago. Dinner was fine. My mom seemed happy. We had the roast she likes and the cake from the bakery on Clement Street. After dinner, Colt asked if he could borrow my car to go meet some friends at the mall. There's a bowling alley on the 2nd level, he said. I hesitated. He'd been drinking at dinner too, wine with everyone else, and I'd watched him pour a second glass when my dad wasn't looking. But when I said I wasn't sure, my dad gave me that look. The one that means, don't make this a thing. And my mom said, it's just 10 minutes away, honey, in that voice that closes a conversation. I handed him my keys. I know. I've thought about that moment every single day since. I handed a person I knew had been drinking the keys to a car I'd worked 60-hour weeks to afford because I didn't want to cause a scene at my mother's birthday dinner. I'm not excusing it. I'm just telling you what happened. About an hour later, my phone rang. It was Colt. He was talking fast, and his voice had that high, tight quality that means something is wrong. He said there'd been an accident in the parking garage, said he'd clipped another car pulling out of a space, hit a pillar, the car was bad, said no one was hurt, said I needed to come right now. I called an Uber. I was there in 15 minutes. When I got to the parking garage, my parents were already there. I still don't understand how that's possible. They live in the opposite direction, and I left before they did. I've thought about it, and the only explanation is that Colt called them first before he called me. That detail is important later. My car was bad. The whole front right side was crumpled. The airbag on the passenger side had deployed, which is where Colt had been sitting. He'd somehow ended up half in the passenger seat, I think, from bracing when he hit the pillar. There was another car nearby with a long scrape along the driver's side door. Nobody else was around yet. No mall security, no other witnesses that I could see. My dad pulled me aside before I could even fully process what I was looking at. Here's what happened, he said. He said it exactly like that. Not, here's what Colt told me, or, I think maybe, just here's what happened, like he was reading from a document. You were driving. You misjudged the turn. You sideswiped the car, overcorrected, hit the pillar. Colt was in the passenger seat the whole time. I stared at him. Dad, I wasn't here. You were here. You drove Colt to meet his friends, and you were going to pick him up later. You came back early. You misjudged the turn. There are cameras in this garage. The cameras on that level have been broken for months, he said. I checked. I don't know if that was true. I didn't know in that moment. What I knew was that my dad had apparently already walked the garage, assessed the camera situation, worked out a story, and was now presenting it to me as fact. All in the time it took me to get there. Then my mom came over and put her hand on my arm and said, quietly, like she was being kind, "Sweetheart, Colt has a meeting with a scout from the Lacrosse National League next month. 1 incident, 1 DUI on his record, and that's over. You're a nurse. You have a stable job. You'll be fine. You are a nurse. You'll be fine." I looked at my brother. He was sitting on the hood of my destroyed car looking at his phone, and he didn't meet my eyes. I said no. I said it clearly. I said I was not going to tell the police I was driving a car I wasn't in, and I walked away to call the non-emergency line myself. My dad caught up with me. He said if I didn't cooperate, he was pulling the tuition support he still provided for a continuing education certification I was doing, a specialty certification that would let me move into the NICU. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was money I didn't have spare, and losing it mid-program meant losing the credits. He said he would also contact my landlord, who happened to be a friend of his, and make things complicated for my living situation. He said it so calmly, like he was discussing a lease renewal. Sign the statement or I pull your tuition tonight. I stood there in that parking garage and I felt something go very cold and very still inside me. And then I thought about my dash cam. I'd installed a dash cam about 4 months earlier after a patient's family member got aggressive with me in the hospital parking lot, and I wanted a record of my commute. It was a dual lens model, front and rear, and it uploaded automatically to a cloud account every time I connected to Wi-Fi. The last sync had been at my parents' house, right before I'd handed Colt my keys. The camera had been running the entire time Colt was driving. I didn't say anything about it. I nodded at my father, vaguely, not agreeing but not arguing, and I went quiet while the police arrived. I gave a short statement that was technically non-committal. I said I had arrived after the accident and I was still trying to understand what happened. The officer noted that and moved on. Colt gave a statement. My parents stood nearby. Nobody breathalyzed anyone because Colt had apparently not been the one the officer was focusing on, and I hadn't been present. I went home that night and I opened my cloud app and I watched the footage. It was all there. Colt getting into the driver's seat. The timestamp. The route from my parents' neighborhood to the mall. His driving, which was honestly watching it made my stomach hurt. He was drifting within the lane, braking late, and at one point he ran a yellow that was already red. In the parking garage, you could see him misjudge the turn completely, clip the silver sedan, overcorrect, and hit the pillar. The passenger airbag deploys on camera. The timestamp says 9:47 p.m. I was in an Uber at 9:47 p.m. I was in an Uber at 9:47 p.m. I have the receipt. I downloaded the footage. I backed it up in 3 places. And then I called a legal aid line. I found through my hospital's employee assistance program because I didn't have money for a private attorney and I needed to understand what my options were. The next week was very quiet on the surface and very loud underneath. My parents texted a few times, normal seeming things, asking how I was, my mom sending a link to a recipe. It felt like they were waiting to see what I would do. My brother didn't contact me at all. I went to work. I cared for my patients. I ate lunch in the break room and talked about normal things with Jules and tried not to think about the footage sitting in my cloud account. Then, about 10 days after the accident, my dad called. He told me that the owner of the other car had filed a police report and that the investigation had been reopened. He said the family's attorney had advised them that if I came forward voluntarily with the correct story now, it would look better for everyone. He said, the correct story. He said it like I had one. I asked him what happened if the footage from my dashcam showed something different. There was a pause. He said, your dashcam doesn't have footage. I checked the car. The unit was damaged in the impact. He was right that the physical unit had been damaged. The camera itself had gotten knocked loose and the lens was cracked. What he didn't know, what he had never asked about because he apparently didn't know how these cameras work, was that the footage had already uploaded to the cloud automatically when Colt drove through my parents' neighborhood Wi-Fi on the way out. It uploaded before the accident. The accident footage came from the rear camera, which uploads separately, and that synced when the car was sitting in the garage near a mall Wi-Fi network. He had checked the broken hardware. He hadn't thought about the cloud. I told him I had to go and I ended the call. 2 days later, I got a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was dense legal language, but the core of it was that my family was asserting that I had been the driver, that the stress of my nursing program had been affecting my judgment, and that they were prepared to argue in any proceeding that I had been struggling with anxiety and impaired decision-making. There was a phrase in there about voluntary evaluation for stress-related conditions. They were going to try to say I was mentally unstable. I sat with that letter for a long time. I read it 3 times, and I felt something shift in me. Not anger exactly, more like clarity, the kind that comes when something you already suspected turns out to be completely true and you don't have to wonder anymore. I called the legal aid attorney the next morning. I told her about the letter. I told her about the footage. She asked me to send her everything, the cloud backup, the Uber receipt, the timestamps, the letter from the law firm. I sent it all that afternoon. She filed a response within the week. She also contacted the investigating officer directly and let him know that dashcam footage existed that was relevant to the open accident report. The officer called me 2 days later and asked if I would come in. I did. I brought my laptop. I showed him the footage. He watched it twice without saying anything. Then he said, "When did this upload?" I showed him the cloud timestamp, 9:31 p.m. on the night of the accident for the front and side footage. 9:52 p.m. for the rear, before and shortly after impact. The system log showed the sync events, the network IDs, everything. "Your father told us the dash cam was destroyed in the impact," the officer said. "The unit was damaged," I said. The footage had already uploaded. He nodded slowly. Then he said I could go, that they'd be in touch. What followed took about 6 weeks, and I'm going to compress it because the middle part is mostly paperwork and waiting, which is miserable to live through and boring to explain. The short version is, the case went to a hearing. My brother was formally identified as the driver based on the footage and the Uber records. My parents' attorney tried to argue that the footage was ambiguous, that you couldn't definitively identify the driver from the angle, but the officer had also pulled the parking garage footage, which, it turned out, had not been broken for months. The camera on that level had been serviced 2 weeks before the accident. It showed Colt walking away from the driver's side door. At the hearing, my parents' attorney pivoted hard to the mental health angle. He submitted a letter. I still don't know how they got this, whether someone was paid or whether they found a doctor willing to write it, asserting that I had a history of anxiety that made me an unreliable narrator of events. My legal aid attorney objected. The judge asked to see the evidence on which the letter was based. There wasn't any. It was a letter asserting something with no supporting documentation. The judge looked at it for a moment and then set it down and asked the bailiff to pull up the dashcam footage on the courtroom screen. The room was quiet. Colt was sitting 3 rows ahead of me, and I watched his shoulders go very still when the footage started playing. My dad was next to him, and he didn't move at all. My mom was on his other side, and I saw her put her hand over her mouth. The front camera footage showed the parking garage entry, the turn, the scrape, the pillar, clean and clear and time-stamped. The rear camera showed the inside of the car for just a second when Colt turned to look behind him before he pulled in, and you could see him, the driver, clearly. The judge asked my brother's attorney whether his client wished to modify his statement. There was a long pause. Then Colt's attorney leaned over and they talked quietly for a moment, and the attorney said yes. His client wished to revise. Colt admitted he had been driving. He admitted he had consumed alcohol prior to operating the vehicle. He admitted that the account provided to police in the initial statement had been coordinated with his parents. My father's face did not change. My mother cried. I sat in my seat and breathed. The legal outcomes were specific, which I know matters to people because it mattered to me. I spent weeks not knowing what was going to happen, and the uncertainty was almost worse than anything else. Colt was charged with DUI, leaving the scene of an accident, and filing a false police report. He was sentenced to 18 months of probation, a fine, mandatory alcohol education classes, a license suspension, and community service. The scout meeting was canceled. His lacrosse season was effectively over. My parents were charged with obstruction and filing a false report. My father received a fine and probation. My mother received probation. The law firm that sent the letter about my mental health was reported to the state bar for review. The civil case for damage to the other car was settled by my family's insurance because it was my car, and Colt was an authorized driver. That part was complicated, and I won't pretend it wasn't. I didn't end up liable because I wasn't present, but it took several months to sort out. My tuition funding was obviously not pulled. My landlord, when I spoke with him directly, said my father had never called him, and he had no idea what I was talking about. I don't know if the threat was real or a bluff. I've stopped trying to figure that out. I haven't spoken to my parents since the hearing. I haven't spoken to Colt either. That's a choice I've made deliberately and not one I came to quickly. There were a few weeks where I thought maybe there was something to salvage, some conversation that could explain how people who were supposed to protect me decided instead to use me as a decoy. I've stopped looking for that explanation. I don't think it exists. What does exist is my life, which is quieter now in ways that are mostly good. I moved to a different apartment. My choice this time, not under any pressure, just a fresh start. I finished my certification program. I work in the NICU now. I spend a lot of my shifts holding babies who are too small and too early and fighting in ways they don't have language for yet, and I find that I'm very good at being steady in rooms where things are fragile. The dash cam is still in my new car. Different model. Upgraded. It syncs automatically every time I come home. I'm not sure what the lesson is supposed to be here. People keep asking me what I would tell someone in my position, like there's a clean answer. What I keep coming back to is this. My father walked through that parking garage and checked the cameras and checked the hardware and built a story and thought he had covered everything. He missed one thing, not because he was careless, but because he looked at what he could see and didn't think about what he couldn't. Some things save themselves, quietly, without you knowing they're doing it. You just have to not delete them before they get the chance. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what my father actually believed when he walked through that parking garage. I don't think he was reckless. I think he was thorough. He checked the hardware. He checked the camera mounts. He built a story with the materials he could see, and he was confident in it because he'd always been the kind of person who moves through situations like he already knows how they end. That's the part that stays with me, not the anger, not even the hurt, but the confidence. How certain he was, how little he thought he needed to account for. My mother said I was replaceable. She meant it practically, the way you'd assess inventory. I had a stable job, a predictable life. Nothing riding on the next 30 days the way Colt's scout meeting was riding on his. In her math, I was the variable that could absorb the cost without breaking. What she didn't factor in was that the cost she was asking me to absorb was my own integrity. My name on a police statement, my record, my word given falsely under pressure. She didn't consider that because I think she'd never really considered me the kind of person who would refuse. That's the thing about being the steady one in a family. People confuse steadiness with compliance. They see you hold yourself together through hard things, and they start to believe that holding yourself together is all you know how to do, that you'll absorb whatever is handed to you because that's your function. It took me a long time to understand that my steadiness was never about endurance. It was about knowing what I could stand behind. I could not stand behind a lie, not that one. What I did instead was small and quiet, and it didn't feel like courage at the time. I downloaded footage. I called a number from an employee assistance pamphlet I'd had sitting in a drawer for 2 years. I answered an officer's questions honestly. None of it was dramatic. I wasn't in a movie. I was tired and scared and eating cereal for dinner in my apartment, trying not to think too hard about the letter from the law firm that said I was emotionally unreliable. But here's what I've come to understand about how things actually unfold. The truth doesn't need you to be brave. It just needs you to not bury it. My father buried what he could see. He didn't know about the cloud sync, so he didn't bury that. The footage existed independent of anyone's decision to protect it. It just sat there, time-stamped and intact, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Colt made choices. To drink, to drive, to let me stand in that hallway getting threatened while he looked at his phone. My parents made choices. To build a story, to send a letter, to use a word like replaceable about their own daughter. Those choices had consequences that I didn't manufacture and didn't control. I just stopped trying to prevent them from landing. I work in the NICU now. I hold babies who have no idea what's happening to them, who are just fighting on pure instinct, and I think about how much of survival is simply not giving up before the situation resolves itself. You don't have to win. You just have to stay honest long enough for the truth to catch up. My father thought he covered everything. He hadn't. That's not luck. That's the natural result of building something on a false foundation. It doesn't hold. It never does. Not permanently. Not when the thing underneath it keeps existing. I'm not interested in their regret, if it exists. I'm interested in my own life, which is quieter now and more mine than it's ever been. That's not a small thing. That took everything I had to protect, and I'd do it again.